So this is part 2 of the teacher training course, where we're going to be going over the student learning modules 5, 6, 7, and 8. And this is kind of incorporating the ideas of part 1 and really talking about the nuts and bolts of the best practices and study skills and habits that a student can use. I find students really like this section. And you'll see that I'm a big fan of Australian artists. So I just put it up there for your visual interest. So part of the process of the course is really an opportunity for students to implement the best habits so they can use reading, note-taking, test-taking skills, and both apply them in other classes that they're taking, but also really to take tests in EPY 150 as well, so that you can talk about how to get ready for test taking. And honestly, there are times when a student is only taking 1 or 2 classes. Sometimes students take EPY 150 and it is the only class that they're taking. And that is why we really need to make sure that we do have kind of a standard procedure, operating procedure for having exams, kind of large summative assessment, at least a couple times during the semester. It's important to connect what the students learned about the science of memory to the best practices, because they're intimately related, to continue journaling habits, and also to explore mindfulness techniques, stress management skills. You can start that from the beginning of the course, but definitely make sure to talk about it here as well. And then explore critical thinking and creative thinking tools. So you'll see the books by Stahl and Goldstein in the works cited references list in one of the teacher training documents that I have for you. And it's a mindfulness-based stress reduction workbook that has a lot of helpful information, but this is where I've taken directly from them to psychologists. I'm not sure if they consider themselves Buddhist psychologists or just psychologists who practice Buddhism, but in any case, they propose that one of the habits of mindfulness is to explore these 8 attitudes of mindfulness: beginner's mind, non-judgment, acknowledgement. Now, that may sound tricky, but it really is this idea that you have to, if a student has an issue, they have to first acknowledge that it is an issue in order to come to terms with it. Now, it's kind of interesting to talk about non-striving in a college success class, and maybe that seems paradoxical. But the case that I often use for students is if they are taking a test, they cannot be thinking about what grade they will achieve on the test while they're answering the questions. It distracts them from paying attention to the question at hand. So to kind of not worry about the final goal is a great habit to incorporate. I find that number 5 is the idea on this list that's most difficult for students to understand. Perhaps they don't understand the word equanimity, but I think once you start saying being even-handed and not jumping to conclusions or always calling something good or bad, that can be a helpful way of talking about the attitude of equanimity. And then I think letting be and self-reliance are sort of understandable. But I'd like you to think about reading there's a book that came out a few years ago called Self-Compassion, and by Kristen Neff, PhD, who talks a lot about cultivating self-compassion. So these are great things to talk about with students to get them to identify if it makes sense to them or what situations they associate with these attitudes. So I would say to put your comments on some of these questions on discussion post for this part 2 of the teacher training. So what are your favorite study skills? Is it SQ3R? I'm a big fan of mind maps. Some of you may hate them. Some of you may love Cornell note-taking. So what are your favorite study skills, and what features or processes do they have in common? And what are the best ways, would be the best ways to remember the 8 attitudes of mindfulness? What suggestions might you have? What mnemonic devices or other tricks might you talk about with students? I know some of you have excellent ideas, so please share your excellent ideas. Now, when I'm giving quizzes and tests, I do a couple of things. First, I talk about how test banks are created and the different types of questions that are created on test banks that some professors use. But one of the most important ideas is really to kind of borrowed from logic, is to talk about the idea that the basic thing about true-false questions is you have to read the questions carefully and look for qualifiers, those adverbs or verbs that are qualifying the meaning of the sentence. Some examples of qualifiers are usually, normally, sometimes, if, rarely. And to really get students in the habit of analyzing the verbiage on test questions, and to let them know that absolute qualifiers often indicate false statements. We say, well, why is this? If you say something is because it's very rare that something is always true or never true. So getting students familiar with analyzing the language of test questions is very helpful. So oftentimes I give them a sort of multi-level question, and I have them read all parts of the statement and say, is this true or false? And to let them know that all parts of a statement have to be true in order for something to be true. So I often give them a very convoluted thing about Martin Luther posting the 95 Theses to the church door in Wittenberg on October 31st, 1517, which is, probably some of the history professors out there might roll your eyes that I would give that as an example, but it's sort of an example of how there's several facts in that statement that have to be true in order for the whole thing to be true. And breaking that down for students is a very helpful process. Talking about how it's kind of weird things that people go through when they're taking tests. So there's a great handout that was created by some community college teacher in Iowa, I think. I can't remember exactly where, but she created this nonsense test, which is uploaded, and several of us have used this before, and it's a great conversation starter because it gets students looking at some common things to look for in questions. So it is a skill to get good at reading questions. There is no substitute for actually studying, but I think it's helpful to talk about the psychology of test making and test taking for students in this course. So there have been some revisions in the latest edition of Becoming a Master's Student, and there's I can't quite keep up with it, but it used to be that there was more of an emphasis on Bloom's taxonomy of thinking, but certainly it's sort of sprinkled throughout the textbook, and I think this is another really helpful discussion point to get students to talk about and explore Bloom's taxonomy and how it relates to levels of learning and what's implied by this pyramid schema. So analyzing the concept is another thing that I find students really enjoy in this section. Students really enjoy the critical thinking section. So another thing that I often do is, and I use this from the discipline of philosophy, what is the basis of an argument? The basis of an argument is an argument contains a premise and a conclusion, and I say, and an argument doesn't necessarily have to be argumentative, which they often think. An argument is simply somebody's idea and their reasons for the idea. So then I kind of randomly put out quotes. So here's an example of a quote attributed to Albert Einstein. I have no special gift. I am only passionately curious. So to get students to talk about, can they identify the premise, the conclusion? Can they analyze what the assumptions of this statement are, what people might assume when they read it, and what are the implications? So one thing I notice is students need to be led through this kind of analysis. It's not a skill that many of them have developed heretofore, that they need to go through the process, and some of them just take to it. So that's a really fun exercise to go through as well. I love the way Dave Ellis also talks about creative thinking as well as critical thinking, that they're kind of all together, divergent and convergent thinking. And one exercise that I like to use is what I would call a forced analogy. So I put up this picture of, Utah, from someplace in Utah, I think, and tell the students, okay, here is your image, and then I'm going to pair this with a random topic. So let's say I say, write about justice and this picture. So how is this picture similar and different to the concept of justice? And just have them do a free write. And then what happens? What kinds of things, what kind of observations do people have in this process? To notice the connections you can make from these. So finally, I like to remind you all that it's also helpful, and this kind of depends on your comfort level with this sort of thing, but I will periodically do some kind of relaxation exercise at the end of class, or lead them through a kind of walking meditation in class. Just some very simple things, even just inhaling, holding, and exhaling. So you inhale for a count of 3, hold for a count of 3, and exhale for a count of 6. And you talk them through that a cycle of 3 times. So this is a way for them to integrate their understanding of how anxiety and stress works, and just try and practice those habits that will be useful to them.